some cultures read bones to tell the future, and some archaeologists read bones to tell the past. The archaeology of human remains applies osteology, the science of bone, to human questions about how people lived and died. And they use many things to do this. First of which is differentiation. Differentiation is the process by which a skeleton becomes unlike any other skeleton. And it has 4 major causes: genetics, activity, injury, and illness. Now, the most common genetic differentiation occurs during puberty when male and female skeletons begin to look different from one another. For example, the pelvis, or hips, of a female become wider and more bowl-like to allow for the carrying and delivery of children, while the male's is much more narrow and angular. Illness also affects bones, sometimes in a general way that only indicates poor health, and sometimes in a way that's more specific to a certain disease. For example, rickets causes a weakness of the bone, which instead of nice and straight and strong, long bones begin to bend and then to buckle and break under the stress of trying to hold up the weight of a human body. Activity changes bone according to force. When forces are exerted by muscles on bone, the bone builds up in response to more tightly anchor those muscles. But when pieces of the same bone are pulled apart persistently during development, it can cause them to not fully fuse into one bone properly. For example, the more work you do with your arms and your shoulders and your upper back, the more force is applied to the muscle attachments at the base of your skull. Just right here. And in response, the bone builds up into specific ridges and patterns that designate the nuchal region of the skull. In 1984, Arthur Sterland did an analysis of 207 scapulae, or shoulder blades, that belonged to drowned sailors in King Henry VIII's navy. And he found a 12.5% incidence of incomplete acromial fusion, which means that this piece of bone here, which doesn't begin to develop until the teen years, never fully attached to the body of the scapula itself. His theory for why there was such a high incidence of this is that habitual use of long bones, which require a very large drawing motion, pulled the acromion piece away from the body of the scapula so persistently that the two never had a chance to fully grow together. Trauma is visible on bone even long after injury because healing is visible on bone. Bones heal themselves by laying down more layers of bone over an injury, like a cast over your arm when it's broken. This at the top is an X-ray of a normal humerus, or upper arm bone. And this one down here is one that has been broken and then healed. And if you see this little thicker, lighter patch, that's where the bone has greater density due to that healing. Now, how all this works together, I have an example for that. My roommate has a condition called scoliosis. It's an abnormal curvature of her spine. And in her case, it's caused by a genetic malformation in her sacrum, or tailbone. This is a normal sacrum, and these 2 points that stick out at the top are where the last vertebra in the spine sits on top of the sacrum. But her sacrum is missing one of them. And so instead of her spine sitting nice and straight on top of her sacrum, like this, her entire spine tilts to the side, which forces her muscles to compensate and pull her back up, which in turn exerts force on her muscle attachments and builds up the bone. So you see how a genetic difference leads to an illness, which leads to an activity change. And that's how all these different factors work together to make a skeleton unique. Now, all of this is applied in bioarchaeology to historical people and events. This is the skull of a young woman nicknamed Jane by the archaeologists who found and analyzed her remains. Jane died in the winter of 1609 in Jamestown, Virginia, which is called the starving time because a full 75% of the population of Jamestown died of starvation and related conditions during that winter. Some archival sources, letters, diaries, admit that Jamestown residents resorted to cannibalism during this time, while others vehemently deny it. And the question was debated for decades before Jane answered it. Her bones show signs of her body having been butchered and cooked after her death. But many of the cut marks we can see on her bone show hesitance and reluctance. They're not full blows. We extrapolate from this a feeling of desperation and a feeling of guilt, which makes sense because the population of Jamestown before the starving time began was only 240. So whoever butchered Jane also knew her when she looked like this. And the same principles apply to a young man who lived here in Florida 7,000 years ago. He had a severe case of spina bifida, a birth defect, in which the spine, the vertebra, never fully close around the spinal cord, leaving it unprotected and torn. Now, due to his severe spina bifida and all of the resulting infections that plagued him all of his life, he was very weak and unable to walk from birth. And yet, he lived almost to full maturity, being between 15 and 18 when he died. Despite being unable to contribute to the community, he was fed and clothed and watered and washed and taken care of and carried from place to place to place by a nomadic people who had neither beasts of burden nor wheels to assist them. Desperation and grief and compassion and care aren't physical things, but that doesn't mean that they can't be seen or that they can't be archaeologically found. Just like water carves rock over time, your life, from your genetics to your choices, sculpts your skeleton every day. And so bones become the most intimate artifacts, giving more insight into people's lives and deaths than anything else could. Thank you.